Have you all had breakfast yet? Because let me tell you, you folks are in for a real sweet treat today. It's an all-new Prove It To Me. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Prove It To Me. I'm your host, Dr. Matt Law, and this episode is going to kick off a little side hobby to my side hobby. Let me explain. Occasionally, my researcher network is going to be too busy actually doing research to join me in talking about their work on the podcast. That's okay. We have other things to do. In the last episode, we talked about news articles and headlines starting with the words study finds, blah, blah, blah. These are some of my favorite things to dig into. Why? There's always so much behind that headline that the news outlets won't talk about. I mean, they can't. They have 60 seconds to summarize what they found in, well, probably the abstract, which is already a summary. Not us, though. We're effing long form here, baby. We got all the time in the world, and I've got you as a captive audience for my unrelenting masochism, taking deep dives into things that no one wants to spend time reading. I got you, boo. So that's what this little sub-series is going to be called, Study Finds. Anytime I see one of these news articles pop up that says Study Finds, I'll do some heavy lifting for you and walk you through what I've found beyond the headlines. It's going to be fun, I promise. I think we'll all learn some cool new things, or you can just put me on in the background like I'm your favorite new sleep app. I don't mind. All right then, let's get into it. Okay, here we go. Study Finds Round 1. So it's 3 a.m., and I'm in a hotel room in Chicago, trying to jumpstart my system with some English breakfast tea so I can get to the airport on time and head back to Florida. Not because I like tea, because housekeeping failed to replenish the coffee in my room. But whatever. Caffeine is caffeine at 3 a.m. So I turn on the only station I could find that was broadcasting any news at that point. Well, I mean, the only station that had news without talking heads to tell me what to think about the news. Before you ask, no. I actually wasn't looking for podcast content. I just genuinely like catching up on headlines for 30 minutes in the morning. Not that desperate. You'll get episodes when I give you episodes. So lo and behold, this headline pops up. Are you ready for it? Of course you're ready. You read the title of the episode, so it's not like you're in suspense. It says something to the effect of, maple syrup can reduce the risk of heart disease. I mean, OMFG, folks. Do you know what that means? This is life-changing stuff. I effing love maple syrup. I remember my mom buying maple candies at a festival when I was a kid, and she'd tell me how to eat it slow because it was super rich. Nuh-uh, Mom. This stuff is going to make me healthy. Give me 10 bottles. I'm going to start chugging. I'll be a living god. Too much? Yeah, okay, I get it. Now listen, I've heard good things about maple syrup before. My wife and I started using maple syrup instead of table syrup a long time ago when we briefly did one of those fad diets. Paleo, I think. It just tastes better too. I'll never go back, honestly, but you know, it's sugar. Most maple syrups that I've bought carry somewhere between 100 and 120 calories per 2 tablespoon serving. Just for context, drinking about 2.5 cups or 600 milliliters of maple syrup would give the average person their daily recommended caloric intake. And by the way, if you're carb conscious, the only macronutrient that's really in maple syrup is carbohydrates, most of which are sugars. So you're really going to tell me with a straight face that this stuff has healing powers? Yeah, so let's dig into the stuff behind the headline. That summary of a summary that I heard in the wee hours of the morning isn't cutting it for me. And I hope you feel the same way. So like most things, this starts with a Google search. Okay, quick tangent. Is Googling something research? No. Google is a mechanism to find research. The only data involved in doing a Google search is the engine itself taking advantage of your user data to provide you information tailored to your preferences and your browsing history. Let's make this interesting and controversial in my example. If two different people try a Google search for guns, let's say one person is a gun control advocate and the other one is a frequent purchaser of guns, the gun control advocate is more likely to receive results tailored to gun control, headlines about recent shootings, and gun safety advocacy groups. The other person will likely receive results related to where to purchase firearms and ammunition, as well as local gun shows, etc. Furthermore, this will all be location based, and up to 50% of the results on the first page will be sponsored results, where the site owner paid Google to get their content into your search if you meet the criteria based on browsing history and user data. I'm going to use that dirty B word here. A Google search is inherently biased. All right, one more thing. If you Google exactly what you're looking for, you will get exactly that. So if I Google coffee causes cancer, the first page of my search will have a selection of links to content describing how coffee causes cancer. If I'm an average Googler, I'll read about 2.5 of those, decide that coffee causes cancer, and that's my new perception. Is it true? IDK, my BFF Jill. Honestly, take a hike, dude. You're not taking away my coffee, and I need some more maple syrup on these buckwheat cakes. Yeah, so back to that maple syrup. I Googled maple syrup heart disease because that's exactly what I was looking for. Lo and behold, just a couple days before, a news article was posted. So I'll include a link in the episode notes so you can follow along. This article was posted by Morning Ag Clips, America's #1 ag news source. Ag being short for agriculture, so farming. The headline reads, "Why substitute sugar with maple syrup?" with the tag, "First human clinical trial explores how replacing refined sugars with pure maple syrup can help in preventing metabolic disease." Aw, that little Grogu model is so cute. I have that Enterprise 1701 model, but is that an NSEA protector? That would look so good on my shelf. Oh, sorry, I got distracted by the things that are forking over cash to Morning Ag Clips for me to read this news article. Okay, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this news article because I already have questions that I know are not going to be answered here. First of all, the headline I initially saw on the early morning news is that maple syrup prevents heart disease. This one is saying that I'm preventing metabolic disease by replacing refined sugars with maple syrup. So already, I'm learning that this is not an article about chugging maple syrup in an effort to seek immortality. Second, where did this article originate? Can you guess? It's Quebec, Canada. Huh, imagine that. Taking a little detour here, World Population Review says that Canada is the top producer of maple syrup in the world, supplying about 75% of all maple syrup with an export value of about $324 million in 2019. The US came in second at $27.5 million. Which city makes the most? You guessed it, Quebec, at almost 8 million gallons of maple syrup per year. By comparison, Ontario produces about 400,000 gallons per year, and Vermont in the United States produces 900,000 gallons per year. Look, I warned you. I said we were going to talk about data, and I'm bringing you data. So this data is telling me that a news article about the health benefits of maple syrup is originating from the absolute largest maple syrup producing city in the largest maple syrup producing country in the world. Now, what we don't do on this podcast is conspiracy theories. What we do is critique. And that includes looking for bias. Is there bias here? What we know is that there's a big potential for it, but we have to read the real research to figure out if that is a factor. The last thing I'm taking from this news article is that this was a human clinical trial. That's got my interest. That means there's going to be data, and hopefully the study is experimental enough to give us a meaningful conclusion. So let's dig into the study, which thankfully can be found as the first link within the text of the news article. Now, the link takes me to the Journal of Nutrition, a journal of the American Society for Nutrition. The article title is Substituting Refined Sugars with Maple Syrup Decreases Key Cardiometabolic Risk Factors in Individuals with Mild Metabolic Alterations, colon, a randomized, double-blind, controlled crossover trial. Now, what I get here is an abstract. Did Morning Ag Clips get more than the abstract? Maybe, but doubtful. It is possible for anyone to get access, but usually you either need to pay for it, have academic credentials, or sometimes the authors can give you access to the full article. The reason I say news articles about scientific studies are usually summaries of summaries is because they're usually only getting the abstract. Who has the time to read the whole thing? And that's why you're here. I'm doing the heavy lifting, so even you don't need to read the whole thing. Unless you want to. I highly encourage it, even. All right, so I'm logging in with my academic credentials. Unfortunately, I can't link you to what I'm seeing, but I will include the abstract link in the episode notes, and you can get access if you would like to the full article. Just know that the abstract takes up about half a page, and the entire article is 13 pages. You're missing out if you don't get access. I like to start with who wrote it and who funded it. So I have 16 authors, and all of them represent organizations in Quebec. The good news is all of those organizations are either universities, research institutions, or nonprofit organizations. I think. My French is a little rusty. Let's run down to the bottom real quick. I have a section that says conflict of interest and one that says funding. That's good. I'm not saying that these things always create bias, but for integrity, the authors should disclose this. In fact, most reputable journals require these disclosures. Now, under conflict of interest, one of the authors reports financial support was provided by Google Translate. Okay, the maple producers of Quebec. Huh. Also, the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries, and Food of Quebec. Okay, so under the funding section, the article reads, the sponsors had no role in the study design, in the collection, analysis, and interpretation of data, in the writing of the report, or in the decision to submit the article for publication. Also, one author received studentships from the Quebec Research Fund for Health and the Maple Producers of Quebec. Another was supported by the Quebec University Hospital Center, and another holds a Pfizer research chair in the pathogenesis of insulin resistance and cardiovascular diseases. Do with all of that what you will. I'm not a pundit. I hate pundits. Pundits are those people who sit around on national news all day and tell you what to think about what little facts they present. I do not want to tell you what to think. I do believe a lot of folks are gullible, but I also believe people are smart. I do want to teach you how to think critically. That's why we're here. We're looking past the headlines and finding facts and data. I'll tell you what these little pieces mean factually, but then the opinions are up to you. Okay, you want to dig into research methods? Let's dig into research methods. This is a randomized, double-blind, controlled crossover trial. What does all of that mean? Randomized means that the participants or the people who are being studied are put into separate groups, and whether they end up in one group or another is decided by chance. There are a few different acceptable ways of doing this, but basically, you can give every participant a random number, put odd numbers in one group and evens in another, or highs and lows, or draw names out of a hat. You get the idea. A double-blind study is where both the researchers and the participants are kept completely unaware of who received which treatment. This is actually a really good way to keep bias out of the study and makes it more likely that the results are not affected by other factors. All right, finally, controlled crossover trial. A controlled study is basically one group gets the treatment and the other group does not get the treatment. Sometimes the group not receiving the treatment gets a placebo or a fake treatment. Crossover means each group receives 2 or more consecutive treatments. The simplest way to set this up with our 2 groups is to give one group the real treatment first, followed by the placebo, and the second group would receive the placebo treatment first, followed by the real treatment. So, just by the title of this study, we figured out that participants are probably getting maple syrup and whatever a placebo for maple syrup would be. They don't know what they're getting, but they're getting one of those followed by the other, and the researchers don't know which participants are placed into which groups. Honestly, this is set up to be a pretty solid experiment, so let's dig a little further into how this played out. All right, so this study took a total of 24 weeks for each participant. By the way, there were 42 total participants in the final sample size, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We have 2 weeks of screening and selection, 2 weeks of stabilization, which I'm actually not sure what stabilization means here, but we're getting into clinical terms that even I'm unfamiliar with. Then each participant was instructed to replace 5% of their total caloric intake that would normally consist of added sugars with either maple syrup or an artificially flavored sucrose syrup for 8 weeks. Then there's a 4-week washout period, meaning they stop doing that replacement, followed by another 8-week period replacing 5% of their added sugar caloric intake with whichever syrup they didn't use the first time. So, real quick, what is sucrose syrup? Sucrose is sugar, and actually, sucrose is also in maple syrup, obviously. What this study is claiming is that we're referring to sucrose as refined and free sugars that are usually added to products, whereas maple syrup is a minimally refined product that naturally contains sucrose but also other natural ingredients. The article actually references studies that found those other natural ingredients have health benefits. So, I'm imagining this sucrose syrup is like a regular table syrup, but if you scroll down to the acknowledgments, it looks like a couple of folks actually prepared the sucrose syrup solution. So it's not like they just bought Aunt Jemima off the shelf. All right, let's talk about sample size or the number of participants that were actually studied. Participants had to be between 18 and 75 years old, and they had to be overweight as well as be at risk for cardiovascular disease based on insulin levels, glucose, glycated hemoglobin, and triglycerides. Then, folks were excluded if they regularly had more than 2 alcoholic drinks per day, if they had recent significant changes in body weight or were in the process of losing weight, if they had eating disorders, recent surgery, some other intestinal, liver, and kidney diseases, and then females were excluded if they were pregnant, planning to become pregnant, or breastfeeding. So they screened 112 people, ended up with 47. 5 more withdrew during the study, so that gives us 42. Now, 42 doesn't seem like a lot. The goal here is to make sure your sample size is big enough to be generalizable to the entire population you are studying. There are ways to calculate what sample size you need, but what you need can change based on the statistical analyses you use, the controls you put in place, and how experimental the study is. For example, when I do survey research, I'm almost always using a convenience sample, meaning I throw the survey out to a bunch of randos and analyze whatever comes back. For that kind of research to be undeniably powerful, I usually need a couple hundred responses. And that's hard to do when survey research generally produces a response rate of 2%, and sometimes not enough people receive the survey. In this case, the authors based their sample size calculation on a previous study, and they determined that 22 participants would give them a power of 80% and a type 1 error of 5%. That means having only 22 participants would give them a pretty highly representative sample with a minimal chance of false positive results. They got 42. Now, the other thing we can take from this is that the results will really only be applicable to the participants they were studying: overweight, at risk of cardiovascular disease, and no other complications. That's good for people who meet that criteria, but it leaves the answer for everyone else in question. Okay, so how did they make sure the participants did what they were supposed to do? food logs, and measuring the amount of syrup that came back. Their compliance rate was somewhere between 92 and 96%. That's pretty good, I'd say. Also, usually you try to get 50-50 on the allocation to different groups. They got close. They got 19 participants that got maple syrup and then sucrose syrup, and 23 got sucrose syrup and then maple syrup. If you look at the characteristics of both groups in the table 1, assuming you get access to this, they're pretty similar. All good stuff. All right, let's talk results. When substituting 5% of refined or added sugars with maple syrup, this study found a statistically significant decrease in glucose AUC. That's area under the curve, if you're curious. It's how long it takes your body to use or store glucose after a meal. Lower is better, especially when it comes to preventing diabetes and cardiovascular disease. There was also a non-statistically significant decrease in incremental AUC. And that just means they saw a decrease, but it wasn't impactful enough or consistent enough to be counted as significant. For the sucrose syrup group, increases in both numbers, but they didn't give p-values for those. P-values are what tell us if the result is statistically significant. All right, what about weight? No changes in body weight or waist circumference between the two groups, but they did find changes to android fat when they did a body composition analysis. So that's the fat that collects in the abdomen, chest, shoulders, and neck. The maple syrup group had a decrease, while the sucrose syrup group had an increase. We also have changes to systolic and diastolic blood pressures, decrease for maple, increase for sucrose. Lastly, there were also differences in gut microbiota, basically looking at bad bacteria that lives in the intestinal tract, in favor of the maple syrup group. Lots of other tests were done, but these were the ones that saw differences between the groups. Okay, let's now look at the discussion part of the article. In most research articles, especially those about studies that have never been done before, the authors will be pretty conservative in their language about the results and their recommendations. Occasionally, something will be so significant and causational that the language gets stronger, but it's really very rare to see that. Remember, correlation is not causation. Yeah, right here is a perfect example. I'll read the excerpt from the first paragraph of the discussion. Quote, despite remaining a significant source of added sugar, which should be consumed in moderation, these results indicate that maple syrup does not exacerbate cardiometabolic risk factors compared with sucrose syrup when consumed in moderate amounts. Example given between 20 and 40 milliliters per day in this study for 8 weeks in participants with mild metabolic alterations. End quote. So if you were curious about what 5% of daily caloric intake from sugars looked like, it's 20 to 40 milliliters per day of maple syrup. That's somewhere between a tablespoon and a half or 3 tablespoons. And it's generally a normal serving size if you look at the back of the bottle. Here's what I want to focus on. Does not exacerbate cardiometabolic risk factors. That language is a far cry from maple syrup prevents heart disease. The authors are saying it does not make your risk worse, but they're not necessarily saying that it's highly preventative either. The authors go on to detail why these different factors matter, which basically amount to things that affect cardiometabolic risk. And then we get to limitations. Now, limitations are important. If you read through a study and there are no limitations listed, I'm going to tell you not to trust it. Every study has limitations. In fact, limitations are a great source for additional research. We must be able to repeat experiments if we want to get closer to causation rather than correlation. And we should be getting better at this research every time. So, what do the authors say? First, they say the results must be replicated in larger and longer clinical interventions and confirmed in more diverse populations. Excellent point. Give me more data. Does this have a similar outcome for people who are not overweight? Can we do this with more than 42 people and in different parts of the world? I mean, Egypt is apparently exporting maple syrup now. What's going on over there? They also cite having issues with getting participants to complete their MRIs because of the pandemic at the time. The rest of the limitations, like how they went about testing secondary outcomes and using a per protocol approach, are also listed, but along with that, they detailed the statistical tests and sampling methods they used for mitigation. Folks, I have to say, I'm rather impressed. This is a good study. So just to recap, here's what we know. This was a study about how replacing 5% of daily caloric intake of refined or added sugars with maple syrup affects cardiometabolic risk factors among overweight adults. It was conducted in Quebec, Canada, which is the largest maple syrup producing city in the largest maple syrup producing country, and it was partially funded by the maple producers of Quebec. Despite that fact, at face value, this was a well-designed study with a good sample size and a lot of controls and tests that help mitigate bias and confounding variables. The authors do not explicitly conclude that maple syrup prevents cardiovascular disease, but they say that this study with these circumstances does not exacerbate the risk. Finally, we need more research and more data. So, I have two questions. Who's going to fund the next study? And what the hell was in that sucrose syrup solution anyway? Until next time, I'm Dr. Matt Law. This has been the first episode of Study Finds on the Prove It To Me podcast, and I'm now feeling a bit famished. I think I'll make some waffles. Blame Canada. Take care and stay safe, everyone. Prove It To Me is produced by me, Matt Law. Original music by West London. You can find this podcast on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. Like what you've heard so far? Please like, subscribe, and follow wherever you get your podcasts. And leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Got questions about what we talked about or research that you want to share? Send an email to contact@proveitpod.com. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and its guests and do not necessarily represent the official position, opinion, or strategies of their employers or companies. Examples of research and data analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based on very limited, often single-use case, and sometimes dated information. Assumptions made within this discussion about research and data analyses are not necessarily representative of the position of the host, the guests, or their employers or companies. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast. The presentation of content by the guests does not necessarily constitute an active endorsement of the content by the host.